Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered Podcast. Today, Colin and I are joined by Keven, who was raised Southern Baptist, in a sense, navigated his way out of faith as a gay man. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. We can dive right into, a lot of our guests have a Catholic background, but you were Southern Baptist. Tell us a little bit about what your childhood looked like and who God was to you growing up.
Yeah, so I'd say primarily it was Southern Baptist. However, I did have experience in almost most of the realms, most of the denominations of Christianity, like everything from Catholic to Southern Baptist to just Baptist to Pentecostal, non-denominational, like all throughout the spectrum. But particularly the school that I grew up attending, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I grew up attending Southern Baptist Church Plant School from K to 12. And that was my primary experience. So it was a fundamentalist Southern Baptist school that emphasized, well, obviously like the Baptist kind of denomination, but it was also a little bit more independent than the actual like Baptist convention. So it was more strict on certain areas than maybe more traditional Baptist churches are.
And so when did you realize that you were gay, and how did that kind of play into your faith growing up?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think for as long as I can remember, I remember being attracted to men. However, if I actually understood that I was gay or like what gay really meant, that's a different story. I think that growing up, I always had the idea that being gay was wrong, or that being gay was like evil, the epitome of evil, or it was just unnatural, things like that. Also, not just coming from the Christian religious side, but also the more cultural side as a like Latino man. There is more of the sense of machismo, so more of the sense of like men have to be a certain way, you have to dress a certain way, or you have to speak a certain way, or like certain things. Play a certain role when it comes to like family, and not very emotional, things like that. And I think that I was always very different than the typical like machismo kind of guy. So I think for like growing up, it was very easy for people to assume that I was gay, or like know that I was gay, and I was like no, I'm not gay like this. And I also did theater, so I was like pretty stereotypical like gay kid in denial. I feel like it wasn't until high school, I'd say, where I actually recognized and more so accepted this part of myself. But since I was within like a pretty conservative evangelical circle, they lean more towards the same sex attracted language. So it was more so being same sex attracted, but not really acting on those desires, like not really identifying with that label or with that lifestyle. It was more so, it was just a temptation as any other temptation. And that's the way that I primarily understood my sexuality when I was within the like Christian circle.
Was it something that they pressured you as something you needed to change about yourself, or was it more just, oh, this is my cross to bear and I have to be celibate for my whole life and all that?
So it really changed throughout my experience as a Christian. I'd say at first, whenever I first started making my faith my own, or actually became born again, as people would say, I was really bent on getting rid of these feelings. I think part of the thing that motivated me to even pursue a deeper relationship with Jesus was condemnation that I experienced with some of my family members after I came out. And it was just like the devil has you in his claws, like you are gonna like go to hell, like all these things. And that led me to actually take my faith more seriously. And there was a period where I would just pray day and night. I would fast. I would like, all of my spiritual energy became consumed with, God, take these feelings away. God, don't, like, praying the gay away, classic praying the gay away. After a couple of years and recognizing that wasn't happening, I became more accepting of this side of myself, and I started leaning more towards, yes, this is part of, it's my cross to bear. It's what I'm laying on the altar. It's what, it's my thorn in the flesh, if you will. And it was more so, if I do find a girl that I'm attracted to, then I'm going to pursue that. And I was open to that. And I think I tried that in several instances. It didn't work out, obviously. But once I got to the point, it was either I'm going to try to make it work with a girl or I'm just going to be celibate. And I think towards the end of my faith journey, had made more peace with the idea of, you know what, I'm just going to be celibate and it is what it is. So
when you say that your journey in faith, was it a pretty gradual change between these ideas, or was your story punctuated by kind of sharp turns or specific experiences that made you change your mind?
Yeah, I think in part some parts of it were gradual, some parts of it were specific instances. I think the gradual part of accepting the desires and just accepting being same-sex attracted was pretty gradual once I spent a lot of time praying and also listening to other speakers who also were gay and but were believers, and hearing their experiences within the Christian faith and how they were able to hold both in tension, both their sexuality and their faith. And so that was a little bit more gradual as I became more exposed to different people who were same-sex attracted but remained celibate. When it comes to me figuring out whether I was personally going to be celibate or pursue like a relationship with a girl, I think it was once I had my first relationship with a girl, that she was sweetest girl ever. Like, I think if it would have worked with anyone, it would have been with her. And once I realized that was just not something that was in me, I couldn't love her in a romantic way. I think that's when I figured out, yeah, no, it's either gonna be celibacy or miraculous divine intervention. But other than that, yeah. So it was, part of it was gradual, part of it was more like punctual.
And then it sounds like you went through kind of a phase of, or a period of time really reconsidering your beliefs. What was it like from more of that intellectual side as kind of your faith journey came to an end?
Yeah. So that's where the bulk of it is, I'd say. I have always been a proponent of the idea that I'm going to believe something because it's true, not because it's convenient, not because it makes me feel good. Even as a Christian, like the reason why I remained a Christian for a long time was because I was convinced that it was true. And the way that I convinced myself, that's like a whole other issue, but somehow I was able to convince myself that it was true. And so that process started pretty much exactly when I fully devoted my life to Jesus, which was in 10th grade. I was around 15, I believe. And that's when I actually started taking my faith seriously. That's when I started actually understanding what it meant to follow Jesus, what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. I started building my community. Everything was revolving faith. Everything was revolving Jesus. That's the media that I consumed, the songs that I consumed. Started leading ministries. I think that's when Jesus started becoming like everything, like God was the center. Like if anyone was a Christian, like I was like that Christian. And I think that I had a really strong passion for the gospel. And I think that's partly why I ended up leaving my faith, because I took it so seriously that I was not going to follow something if I didn't think that it was true. So because I was so serious about it, I took any kind of argument against it or any kind of inconsistency with it seriously. Again, because of the desire to pursue truth, not just convenience, not just what felt comfortable. And in that process, I would have questions. And that's when I started becoming really into the notorious apologetics. And anytime that I had a question, I would find some kind of answer. I would find some kind of answer within Christian apologetics. And for those that don't know, apologetics is pretty much the defense of the faith. So trying to find ways, whether that be like scientifically, historically, archaeologically, philosophically, to defend the Christian faith. And I became I was the biggest apologetics nerd, and I would know how to answer most questions, how to navigate through debates, all of these things. When I would go out in college and evangelize to people, I knew how to like lead conversations so that like it'd be sort of like a gotcha moment, you know? But throughout that process, I think each instances and each experience that I had, I always had like creeping doubts. And it was sort of like my critical brain, my critical thinking was like, wait, like this is like an alert, like this doesn't feel right, this doesn't really make sense. But my mind, or like what I had been taught, my indoctrinated mind was more so, this is the devil speaking, or this is just your flesh speaking, or whatever. And it got to the point where especially I started leading a ministry in college. It was my senior year of college. I became president of a college ministry. And I think in that moment, a lot of the doubts really started creeping in. We went through this thing called like the Bible in a year. So we read like the entire Bible, and that really exposed, like I had read the Bible all my life, but going through it chronologically really exposed me to more of the harder parts of the Bible that we tend to like ignore or just explain away. And it made me actually have to wrestle with them and actually have to study them. And as I studied them and wrestled with them and looked up resources, I felt like the answers weren't satisfactory. And I felt that if I was doing a lot of special pleading, if another religion could have said very similar things. And throughout that process, I just became very hard to truly believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. Fast forward, I was still a Christian. Fast forward, I moved to Rhode Island, pretty random state. But once I graduated college, I moved to Rhode Island to work and do research here. And it was my first time actually being outside of sort of the echo chamber that I was in growing up, like my entire life. And in that moment, it was the first time where I actually had the space to question, I actually had the space to think for myself. And it's very interesting because the spaces that I was in before were very question friendly, quote unquote, because they would say, yeah, like God wants your questions, like your questions will lead you closer to him. Your questions will, like God is not scared of your questions. However, that was true so far as you accepted the answers that you were given. So you could only question to a certain extent. And if this answer didn't make sense, that's like, you just had to stick with that. But you were only allowed to question so far as you would reach this conclusion, as you would reach certain beliefs or certain doctrines, or affirm certain doctrines, certain beliefs. So you weren't really allowed to question. It was sort of a form of pseudo questioning. And it got to the point where as I continued studying, I genuinely could not bring myself to believe the inerrancy of the Bible. I could not bring myself to believe many of the things that I was taught to believe. And it led me to probably the darkest place that I've ever been in my life, because I was caught between a rock and a hard place. I was like, I can't believe these things anymore, but I'm afraid to leave. Because if I leave, like, what if I go to hell? Like, what if I like commit the sin of apostasy or whatever it may be? And because of that, I just led me to a really dark place where I seriously considered, I was like, okay, no matter how much I try, I can't believe this. I can't follow this anymore. So either I leave and walk away and become an apostate and risk going to hell or whatever that may be, or I stay in something that I genuinely do not believe. And that was a really hard place to be at. And in that moment, the most logical answer to that, I considered, was taking my own life. And I was like, I'd rather just take my own life now before I walk away and become an apostate. But I just know I can't. This is not something that I can believe in anymore, even if I tried. Like, I tried everything from praying to fasting to just seeking an own personal relationship with God, setting questions aside, setting the logic aside, and just focusing on the emotional side, the spiritual side. Like, everything that anyone told me to do, like, I tried it and nothing worked. And I think there were 2 weeks where I was very heavily considering it, the most that I've ever considered it in my life. And it just came to a point where I realized this is not a sustainable way to live, and I need to make a change if I want to even make it to the new year. And it led to getting to that dire situation to actually make a change. And once I got to that point, that was when I actually started embracing the questions that I had, the doubts that I had, navigating through them in a way that I didn't feel I had to reach a certain conclusion. And for the first time in my life, feeling like I was actually pursuing truth and searching for truth, not just searching for an illusion of truth or for selecting facts that already aligned with what I wanted to believe. And I think that has been an ongoing process, but it has led me to probably the most authentic and the most genuine and the like healthiest place that I've ever been at, which I'm really happy about. but it has definitely taken a lot to get to this place. But I think it's has definitely been worth it. So that's my story in like a little nutshell. So the part of the doubt part anyway.
We're really happy to hear that it ended in a good place. Absolutely. It's not an easy journey to go on for sure. It's one thing I remember thinking in high school when I was first having all my doubts, that it almost felt like you're trapped in like this logic box, you know, because you're like, wait, there's something that's not right about this. Like I can tell there's something's not right, but every time you sort of try to make a left turn or a right turn with your logic, they're like, aha, I have an answer here. That's this or that. And you're like, okay, I guess that's right. And you just don't have the wherewithal to know what to do with this stuff. But I think it's once you get that sort of distance where you're not going to church every week and you're not praying every day and you're not doing you're not immersed in it constantly. It gives you that sort of cool down time to like really take a step back from it all and be like, okay, does this actually make sense? Are these answers actually good answers? You know?
Right. And it's that, and then coupled with the pressure of like, these are people that you have genuine relationships with, that you have actual connections, like emotional connections with. So it's not as easy as just like changing your beliefs and that's it. It affects every area of your life.
Yeah, that's something I think a lot of religious people don't necessarily get. They think it's like, oh, especially when the whole like, oh, you just, for us as gay people, I think the assumption and the accusation that gets thrown around a lot is like, oh, well, you just couldn't hack it. You just wanted to like live your sinful lifestyle, and so you couldn't live by the commandments, and so you gave up or whatever. And I think it's not that there's no correlation, but what I think they're missing is that we have such a big ask, such a big amount is required in that paradigm of us that it forces that confrontation. You know, for so many of us, it brings you to that point where you're really forced to take an honest, hard look at this stuff in a way that a lot of Christians I don't think are ever really forced to. And it just doesn't always hold up when you have to look at it that way.
And that's where, as we kind of transition into some of your writings, that like, it seems to me at least that apologetics is the game of kind of like self-soothing doubt, but that apologetics might work if you're super invested in the faith, like you really want to be Christian. But as soon as you start asking like, is this good for my life? Do I actually really want to be here? Maybe I do want to be somewhere else. It seems that the answers of apologetics start crumbling really fast. In your writings, you talk kind of about some of those failures of the epistemology of apologetics. What do you think on a grand scale, the problem why apologetics doesn't convince people at the end of the day to join the faith?
That's a really good question. I think that what I've noticed, at least personally, is that for apologetics to work, there needs to already be a framework. There needs to already be some kind of, again, I use this word, but pre-indoctrination, like pre-bias towards believing in this. Because again, most of the answers I'd say aren't strong. Therefore, I don't think they really will convince many people who are not already predisposed to believing that. And obviously that's not the case for everyone. But I'd say, at least in my experience, what I've seen most of the time, apologetics serves as a way of making yourself believe that you have a reason to believe what you already want to believe. And if someone doesn't already have that like layer, it'll be hard to have apologetics actually make a change, especially because I feel a lot of different religions have, like, you can do most religions have some kind of apologetics. So you could defend different areas of many different religions. So if you are truly trying to be unbiased and are truly trying to pursue truth, I believe that you have to give as much merit and as much weight to a Christian apologist as you would do to a Muslim apologist or whatever apologist. And because I think the kind of arguments that apologetics rely on are pretty vague enough that they can be used and translated across religions, specifically more of those thought-stopping cliches, they do not tend to be strong enough to defend one particular belief system. You could go into more like the resurrection kind of, like more specifically Christianity's apologetics of, when it comes to the resurrection, and that's like a whole other can of worms. But I think primarily, what apologetics rely on is a predetermined desire to believe in something.
That's where I remember going out to Utah a ton for work and starting to meet Mormons and seeing their apologetics. and it was eerily similar to my own as a traditional Catholic. And then as you like start really fleshing the arguments out, they're using the same exact arguments to get to wildly different conclusions.
Right.
And usually, especially in the Catholic world, people will make these crazy like, oh, well, pantheism can't be true because if God is the universe is limited and therefore pantheism is wrong. And they'll just like throw these religions out the door just on their face. And then as soon as they have their own like, well, we got to talk about free will, they're like, no, we got to slow down. We got to have like a 12-hour long discussion on it. When it comes to the Muslim apologists, it's just like, we got one sentence, throw that away, one sentence, throw it away. And then you start realizing when you get into apologetics, everybody's using the same things, the same level of arguments, but getting to just wildly different conclusions. Let me pull up.
I often found, especially the way apologetics was taught to me as like a traditional Catholic, they always said there were like 3 big questions that they wanted to answer, and if you could answer the 3 questions satisfactorily, you would like get somewhere where they were supposed to be. And it was, is there a God? Is Jesus Christ God? And then for us, it was, is the Catholic Church Jesus Christ's true church? You know, and it was, those are the 3 like steps that you have to get people on. And I found a lot of energy is spent on the first step, like, is there a God? And I think almost all of the arguments are essentially identical across like every religion. They don't really get you to one God or the other. And a lot of energy is focused on that part. I think because probably, internet atheism was very popular somewhat recently. And so there's a lot of apologetic energy spent combating that. But then I feel like they sort of skip over the second step a lot of times, or they'll give sort of like, okay, they'll give you some answers about how the resurrection can be proved. But the minute you really start looking into the actual history of things, the claims start falling apart pretty quick. Yeah. And then don't even get me started on the Catholic Church one, but that's a whole other conversation.
That's where I think another failure in apologetics is that they always want you to have an answer. There's some questions that they ask, and you're just like, I don't feel like I have to have an answer, nor do I think I could give a good answer, nor does anything in this conversation have any amount of weight. In your writings, you have a section called like the uselessness of argumentation. Tell me a little bit about some of your thoughts there, and how you use that to approach people when they, I don't know if people wanted to like debate you after you leave, but yeah, let's hear a little more about that.
Yeah. I think that has probably been one of the most disheartening parts of leaving the Christian faith is, again, the uselessness of argumentation, because I feel that I fought like with everything that I had, like absolutely everything to like stay a Christian. Like I studied probably more than most Christians that I knew. I took my faith more seriously than most people that like most Christians that I knew. Like I took this seriously. And not just the rational side, but like the emotional side. Like Jesus was like my entire being, like my heart, my life, my mind, like everything was like Jesus. And I think that the reason why I left, again, it was not primarily because I wanted to. It was not because I wanted to sin. It's not because of X, Y, and Z. It was genuinely because my desire for truth led me away from Christianity. And it's really hard whenever you show people and you do so much research and put so much effort into your faith and the reason why you believe what you believe. And then you tell people that and you explain to them why. And they either just close their eyes, shut their ears, like, and either don't listen or just regurgitate like the same kind of rhetoric that they've been taught to say. And it's really, really hard whenever you tell someone, okay, these are the reasons. Like I literally, it's frustrating. Like I don't even know how long that paper was. Like I wrote like a whatever page paper, 15, 20, I don't remember how long that paper is, but like to explain to my community, hey, these are the reasons why. And it just feels like all of these reasons and all of this work is in vain because none of it works to like change people's minds, or at least that's what it feels like. It's like, no matter how much I tell you, like, hey, this religion and this belief system led me to like literally almost like end my life, and you are still telling me, oh, I'm praying for you, like, oh, I want you to come back. Like I think that's probably, and even hearing that from the from the mouths of people that love you is probably like one of the most hateful things, I feel like, because I'm literally telling you, hey, this almost killed me. And I think about it sort of like in a like abusive relationship. Like if I had a partner that was abusive to me, that led me to like a really dark place in my life, and that led me to like almost like end my life. And I come to my best friend and I'm like, hey, this is like what happened. Like this person is doing this to me. Like I tried to make it work, X, Y, and Z. And then they're like, oh, but like they still love you. Like, oh, but they still want to be with you. Or maybe you're the problem. Maybe there's like that feels like that feels like hell. And I can explain to them, no, this person did all these things to me. But I think at the end of the day, the reason why they believe isn't because of the evidence. Therefore, evidence and reasoning and logic isn't going to lead them away, because there's a kind of comfort, there's a kind of safety, there's a kind of emotional connection, emotional relationship, dependence, indoctrination that has already taken place, that it takes more courage to leave than to stay. And I don't think that if people, and similar to like what you were saying, many people don't have strong enough of a reason to leave. For example, like us as like queer, like gay men, staying had like a super, super high cost. So it made us actually have to sit with this and like consider and evaluate like, oh my gosh, is this real? Like for me, I was willing to sacrifice everything so long as it was for the truth. Like I don't want to sacrifice all these things for a lie. And I think that's an experience that most Christians don't really have to experience. So they aren't faced with the difficulty of having to sacrifice such an integral part of the human experience, which is like romantic love, which is like companionship. Obviously, I know Christians will say there's many other parts that they do sacrifice, and sure, I don't want to invalidate that. And at the same time, there is something different about the companionship. There is something different about all the like that aspect of the human experience, and not just sacrificing that, but being told that is inherently wicked, evil, sinful, twisted, and seeing the effect that has on your community. I think that's a very, very hard thing to watch. So I think that no matter how much you argue with people, how much you explain to people where you're coming from, they oftentimes haven't reached a point where it has affected them personally enough where they actually have to consider these questions.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear stories, the thing that kicked off somebody's deconversion isn't the reason why people leave, and that like the issue of homosexuality caused me to pull my magnifying glass to like, where's this evidence that we always talk about? And then you just like search everything with a magnifying glass, and then you realize kind of the whole ordeal just isn't there. So and it's a hard thing for people to understand that like I didn't leave because of homosexuality, but that caused me to start investigating things.
Right.
Yeah, there are two very different things. Where you start and where you end up are not the same thing. And I think apologists love to steamroll that into you left because, and that's the worst phrase on planet Earth, is when somebody else tells you why you left.
Oh my God.
No.
They love doing it too. I will say it's also interesting just the fact that to so many, I think, Christians, they're so quick to downplay the importance of romance, companionship, and even like sexual companionship in like the human experience. They're always like, oh no, you don't need that. You're not going to die if you don't get that. It's not like food or water or shelter or whatever. Like it's just something you have to get up for God or whatever. It's fine. Like you're just over exaggerating how important that is. And then if you take a step back and look at like Christian community life, it's almost entirely oriented around finding, a good wife and having children and raising the children in the faith and having that sort of the family as the building block of not just society, but your entire social and communal life. It's the center of everything for so many Christian communities. And so I think it's something that, I don't know if it's a refusal to engage with that or if they just don't want to, but I think it's frustrating for a lot of us when it's something we're growing up told is like the most important part of life. And then they're saying, oh no, you don't need it. You'll be fine. It just feels frustrating.
Yeah. The way that I like to sort of explain it to someone who like is straight is, imagine, like when you're a kid and you have like, I'm talking to a guy and you're like, you have this crush on this girl and like you like get giddy around her and you have like butterflies and you want to get her like chocolates, like a rose or something. And like if you say that's like your parents, they might celebrate that, or to your friends and they might be excited for you, all these things. Since you were a kid, something that seems so innocent, something that seems so just like there's no kind of malice behind that. Like there's not even like a sexual nature behind that necessarily. And imagine like anytime that you had those feelings, like you were told that was evil, that was twisted, that was wicked, and that you deserved hell because of that. Like that, it's not just the fact that you're giving up companionship. It is the way that this kind of ideology completely demoralizes queer people, completely demoralizes their experience. And then further on, it's like being like, if I'm telling a straight man, yeah, it's like you have those things for a girl in your class, and then you're told that you have to be with a guy. Like, if you're not with a guy, and because you don't have feelings towards a guy, you are twisted and you are unnatural. And imagine living that like every single day of your life. It messes with your mind. It messes with your head. It messes with every part of you. And in a way, it's like kind of torturous. Like, if you ask like a straight man to be with another man that they have no attraction to,
or even just see one in a movie.
Exactly.
Where like conservatives melt down over like they see a billboard and there's a gay couple, or there's homosexuality everywhere, and then you ask them to clarify and it's like 3 cases, and then you're like, so imagine growing up where every movie, every couple that you see in real life, every billboard, every fairy tale, every math problem, every conversation with your friends, every conversation with adults were only about homosexuality. Like, that'd probably get them super uncomfortable. You're like, yeah, that's what we mean by representation.
Exactly. 100%. And I think that's the kind of gravity that many people, many evangelical or many just Christian circles don't understand. And again, one of the reasons why some people would say, oh, it's like that young rich ruler that came up to Jesus and was like, oh, I've done everything. What else do I have to do? And Jesus was like, give up your riches. And he said he couldn't do that because he loved them too much. And for a while, what I was told is like, this is like your, like the last idol. Like, are you willing to give this? Like, is this what you are going to walk away from Jesus for? Then that's primarily why I made sure that my deconstruction process was not based on what my desires were, but more on like the logical, like rational side of things. Just because I knew that was a common like argument, that just reminded me of that. But no, I think that definitely growing up with that kind of rhetoric and like what is normal, what is not normal, does really intense harm to young developing minds, for sure.
I think it would be interesting if you wouldn't mind like maybe going over some of the big reasons for your eventual deconstruction that you discovered once you started looking into stuff. Like, what were some of the big questions that you found unsatisfying answers for that really pushed the needle for you?
Right. So I'd say one of the bigger ones since I was young was always evolution, and it was always reconciling what we know about the earth, the universe, through like science, through cosmology, through astronomy, through all of these things, reconciling that with the Genesis story. And I tried it for a long time. I have read everything from Answers in Genesis to going to the Creation Museum to the Ark Encounter to more theistic evolution to all of these things. Like I know all the apologetics answers to these things. Like I could recite them. Like I know them. And I got to a point where I couldn't really deny the evidence against a young Earth or against a worldwide flood. Pretty basic things like this, that eventually I came to a point where there were some resources that said, well, maybe these are more metaphors. Maybe you have to take these symbolically, or trying to sort of explain these things away, or say, oh, this isn't like a primary doctrine. This isn't like this isn't a primary issue. However, the more that that was not a satisfying answer for me, because of how interlinked I believe the Genesis creation story is with the gospel of Jesus and the core message of who we are, whether that be how sin came into the world, where our desires come from. I think that if the evolutionary theory is somewhat true or is true, it opens a whole can of worms that makes understanding Genesis very, very difficult. So I think more of like that like scientific side. I'd also say more of the moral issues, whether that be the mass killings ordered in the Bible, of children, of babies, of older women, older men, like just so much bloodshed, innocent bloodshed in the Bible. I would also say the historical accuracies or inaccuracies of some of the like books in the Old Testament primarily, whether that be prophecies in the book of Daniel, or whether that be differences in Kings versus Chronicles versus just more of the discrepancies in that. Also the discrepancies in the gospel resurrection accounts were a big one for me. I remember I was always told, oh yeah, these are just complementary, these all make sense. So I remember back when I was still a Christian, I got like my little notebook and I wrote like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and I wrote exactly how each one describes the resurrection, how each one describes like everything that happened, and I tried with everything that I had to make them fit. And I was just like, if the single most important historic event in the history of mankind, if I can't even get like a solid understanding of how that happened, how am I to trust this? Like, how am I, like, this is the like, if anything is supposed to be accurate, it is this. And the answers that we're being told of these are just compliments, or these are just different eyewitnesses account that emphasize different things or whatever. And like, it was crap. Like it didn't line up. It didn't add up at all. I think primarily, again, the scientific inaccuracies, what that meant for, specifically in the book of Genesis, what that meant for the core message of the gospel, the core message that Jesus taught in the gospel, according to the gospels, more of the historical inaccuracies with the Old Testament books with what we know from extra biblical sources, the resurrection accounts, and yeah, I think those are some of the primary ones. And again, more of like the moral issues regarding genocide or the role that women play, slavery, things like this, that apologetics usually has pretty go-to answers that I don't actually hold up to scrutiny. Yeah.
I enjoyed on Cliff and Stewart recently did a podcast with Alex O'Connor trying to explain away why women weren't allowed to talk in church. And they're like, the women were just being so loud in the first century. Like these liturgies were just off the rail. So he's just saying, like, he's just calling out these crazy women. You're like, that's my favorite defense for women having to be quiet, is that they were just, those first century ladies were just wild and in the spirits, I guess.
Yeah, I've started to find that a lot of apologetics relies on sort of inventing something, and they're like, well, this could have been the case, and that would solve the problem. And it's like, yeah, but that's nowhere in the text. You just made, and it's interesting that the more you look at like early church doctrine formation, the more you realize that it's kind of all that, like the idea of the Trinity, the idea of Christ having one person, two natures, right? That's how it works. Yeah. Like all of these different like specifics that got hammered out over the first couple hundred years, like it all comes down to people being like, hang on, how do we reconcile this thing and that thing? And someone's like, well, it could be that it's like this super complicated structure that we can just make up now. And I'm like, I don't know, the more you,
as long as there's like a 1% like possibility, that's enough. Like you just take it and run.
That's where so much of apologetics would never hold up in a court of law. Like if you go to contest a speeding ticket and they're like, so we got you locked on the radar, and you're like, well, the radar could be wrong. And then they're like, but we calibrate it. And you're like, well, the calibration could be wrong, or something could have changed. It's like, I mean, yeah, theoretically there could be a conspiracy between the calibration of the radar calibration company, that particular cop, that particular judge, and everybody else could be real. And it's like, that's possible. And most apologetics is like all of these crazy games that you're like, this could happen. And you're like, sure. But what's the more likely explanation is not that first century women were just absolutely too crazy. And really, Paul was super pro-feminist. He just wanted them to bring it down a few notches, right? And there's so many like micro examples. I also think that apologists, when you bring up these objections, they'll like hammer down on one, and then you're like, maybe. And then you realize they've got to hammer down on like 100 other points with these other half-baked things to get to a conclusion that's 100%. Like faith isn't like, an apologist isn't like, well, I think it's more plausible that Christ existed than not, so I generally go to church on the weekend. It's like, we got to have these like crazy conspiracies that are not more likely true than not, but are like absolute. And then not only is that absolute, but then everything else is absolute. And you're like, wow, we were doing a lot. I think faith is doing a whole lot of work in this apologetic system.
There's one thing I remember growing up, like learning about faith. There's something, a lot of times, we were always told, oh, well, atheists just think that faith is just blind belief with no reason. But actually what faith really is trusting someone that you have a good reason to trust. And we know that God is trustworthy, so we're going to put our trust in God. I remember thinking about that a lot and trying to learn about the Bible and the teachings of the church and what God has claimed. And time again, you can find, well, the Bible's wrong about a lot of things, just objectively wrong about a lot of things. And what's being asked of me in the name of this is so much why should I make this leap of faith and put my trust in something that isn't accurate and that is asking so much of me? Like it's you have this motivation for looking, that's because you're being asked a lot, and then it's not clearing even the lowest bar of trustworthiness, and then they're asking you to make this leap, and then they're mad when you can't do it, I guess.
What do you make of I think I was listening to, it might have been the same podcast with Alex O'Connor, talking about when Christians love talking about morality and objective morality. And there's so many things in Christianity that you're like, if morality is objective, certainly that is not the case that this is allowed or that is mandated. Like, if we grant that morality is objective, Christianity is just not it.
Well, especially with the Old Testament stuff. Because anyway, I don't want to get a whole rant about problems with the Bible, because we'll be here all day.
William Lane Craig, Taliban.
Exactly, the William Lane Craig. That's what I was going to go down.
What do you make of when people argue the first step kind of for the existence of God, which I've always found to just be these crazy word games that we're treating like science? And I tend to say, especially when they like try to nail you down on like the Big Bang, you're like, I don't know, that seems like a great field of research that people spend entire careers researching, and we spend billions of dollars, and we keep figuring out what the beginning of the university of the universe look like. But I don't know if William Lane Craig's better than the leading particle physicists out there when it comes to what the Big Bang looked like. What do you make of when people start arguing for the existence of God, especially kind of in the Protestant apologetics realm?
So I think it depends on like what argument they use. If it's primarily the how could this have, like, without God, how could blank have happened, which is pretty God of the gaps. That is one that it's not really convincing for me, because just by looking at history, like, if there's so many instances in history where anything that we didn't know, we would put God in, and as these things have been discovered, as more knowledge has been acquired, there has been like less of a need for God to explain these things. So you have to reinterpret how you explain God or explain God's role in these phenomena. And so I primarily struggle with, at least whenever the argument is portrayed of, if God doesn't exist, then how does blank exist? Because I feel like that's an argument out of just our own ignorance, that we don't, like, our own lack of knowledge. So that's not enough for me. And I think there are other arguments for the existence of God or the existence of a higher power that I think are maybe have more legitimacy to them, that are more that I'm willing to engage with, more that I'm willing to evaluate, because I think I consider myself a non-resistant non-believer, which pretty much just means that I am not an unbeliever because I hate God, or because I am like angry, or because I am bitter, or I'm hurt, or whatever it may be. It's simply because I haven't found enough evidence or compelling evidence to believe in a specific like religion or belief system. But I mean, I'm open to the idea of a God. I'm open. I think the most honest answer that I can give is I don't know. And because of that, I'm open to different arguments. Again, I think I haven't found any that are convincing. I think there are some that have more legitimacy than others. But whenever I hear an argument, I am always down to listen. I just haven't found any that are compelling enough.
One of the lines that you have in your writing that I highlighted is, a question I'd like you to consider is, how would the world look different if there was no God? I would dare to say, not much different. I just thought there was a great line, both when we look at the world at large, which is like, I don't see Christianity as the solution to nearly any problem out there that's facing the world. But then also in our own lives, you talked a little bit earlier that like you were in Christianity, it was everything, you're part of these groups, and then you left and you're flourishing and you're living your best life. Did you think that your life after leaving would just be terrible, depressed, giant God-shaped hole in your heart? Versus how is it actually now living life on your own terms?
That's a really good question. I think that that's what I was taught. I was taught that I was always going to have this God hole in my heart, that I was going to feel empty, that I was not going to have meaning, that I was not going to have purpose, that I was not going to have hope anymore, any of these things. I think in the moment, I think I believed that. I think I believed that there was nowhere else that I could go other than Jesus. I think like when Jesus Jesus preaches. There's a specific instance where Jesus is preaching, and then what he says offends people, and a lot of his followers like end up leaving. And then Jesus says to his disciples, "Are you gonna leave too?" And I believe Peter might have said, like, "Where else would we go? Like, there's no other, like, where else can we find words of life?" And I think that's the kind of mentality that I had of there's nowhere else that I could go that would be better than this. And I think that's what you're taught to believe. I think that's part of the indoctrination part. I think that's part of keeping you within the system. So I think that once I was considering leaving, my main focus, I didn't know what my life after would look like. I don't even think I considered that as much. I think I just considered what my life was now and realizing it wasn't sustainable. I had no idea what my life would look like. I was terrified. I lost like pretty much all of my community, all of my friends, or at least my relationships with all of my friends shifted. Like it was not the same at all. I like my own faith, my own journey out of faith has led to many of my friends like crying over me, like praying over me, like losing hope, losing like so many things. And that's really hard whenever you are at a place where you feel like you're like at your healthiest and you are at your happiest, and the people who you had the strongest relationships with are mourning that. And that's a really hard feeling to navigate through. I think that I don't feel any kind of hole in my heart. I don't feel any kind of like God-shaped hole. I think that if anything, walking out of faith has led me to, again, the healthiest place that I've been in mentally, emotionally. And it's interesting because I was taught that anyone outside of the church was just deceived and deranged and like so depraved. Like all they wanted to do was like party and drink and have sex, and like it was just like wild. And honestly, like that's not really me. Like I mean I've definitely like explored, and I'm like, and I've it's taken like trial and error to figure out like where my own values and where my own morals lie. But I realized that a lot of my morals and my values did not start whenever I became a Christian. Like who I was didn't start whenever I became a Christian. Like I already existed. I already had my own personality and outside of Christianity. And I think a lot of that has stayed. Like I think even though I've changed in a lot of ways, I think I've also remained the same. Like I'm still, like my personality hasn't necessarily changed. My beliefs have, but my personality and like who I am at the core did not come from Christianity and could not be taken away with Christianity. So I think that's been a really beautiful thing to come to terms with, that I still have myself. Like I did not lose myself within Christianity, and that wasn't my whole identity. And exploring myself outside of that has been probably one of the most liberating and beautiful journeys that I've like ever been on. So
what advice would you give if somebody's listened to your story, they think that kind of their faith or their spirituality is coming to an end? What advice would you give them to navigate that transition from a religious group where they have their identity, they have their community, to rebuilding their life? Either words of wisdom or encouragement or ideas you'd suggest to them as they navigate that big new chapter in life?
Crap. That's hard because, you know, like every situation is so different. But I would say that no matter how dark things seem, things will get better. And that the pain, the growing pains and the transition and the loss of relationships and the loss of friendships and the loss of even feel like you're losing yourself, like none of these things are permanent. And I think what's really important is surrounding yourself with people who are actually safe, people who will navigate through these processes with you. Something that really helped me was my friends that I made here that were not Christian. And I was able to tell them like my experiences, and they didn't have this predisposition to Christianity. So they were actually able to look at me and be like, Keven, this is crazy. Like, this is not normal. Like, this is not like this belief and like these things, they're like, not everyone thinks like this. And I think it's very easy to think that everyone has the same belief, or like everyone believes this, and it's such a big deal for everyone because that's the people who are like in your immediate circle. But if you get out of that circle, you actually recognize, there's actually a pretty like small population that actually holds these beliefs this tightly. So I think surrounding yourself with people who will hear you out, who will speak, who will just support you throughout that process. And I mean, for me personally, like therapy also like helped a lot. Like finding a secular like therapist who I could talk through these things with was also like really, really helpful, because it takes a lot of work to unlearn what you have been taught for so long. And I think I'd say along with that, just giving yourself grace, giving yourself patience, knowing that it's not linear. It's definitely like up and down. There's going to be moments when you're going to feel so ashamed of yourself. There's going to be moments when you're going to feel like you want to go back. There's moments when you might go back. There's moments when you're going to feel angry. Like just like ride the waves of anything that comes your way, because I think it's all part of the process. But above all, I'd say being gracious and kind and patient with yourself, and surrounding yourself with people who will encourage and uplift you on the journey.
I love that. Yeah, that's, I think we'll end on that note unless, Colin, you have any other thoughts?
I was going to say that I second all of that. That's all perfect.
Yeah, I think, I remember when I was leaving and it felt like the world was ending and that I wasn't ever going to be able to forget these things. And you keep pushing through, you go day by day, and a year later, you're like, I am so glad I left, and that it does not feel like the end of the world anymore. So thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading through the document that you provided.
Well, thank you so much for having me, for sure.
I was going to say, is there anywhere that people can find you? Do you have any projects you're working on that you want people to know about? Things like that?
Well, I'm actually in the process of figuring out how to navigate sharing my story, and how to navigate going through like helping other people who are in the same place that I am at right now. I think primarily my main way of doing that is through like my social media, primarily like my Instagram. It's at Keven Raphael __. My name is spelled a little weird. It's Keven, and then Raphael. And that's where I try to post and try to share bits of my story, and where I post like more of my writings, where I post more of just my experiences within Christianity and deconstruction. That's there are other things that I'm planning, but for right now, that's probably like my main source of interaction.
Awesome. I encourage everybody to give Keven here a follow, and yeah, we'll end on that note.